This is the AWS Morning Brief Security Edition. AWS is fond of saying security is job zero. That means it's nobody in particular's job, which means it falls to the rest of us. Just the news you need to know, none of the fluff. Today's episode is brought to you in part by our friends at Minio, the high-performance Kubernetes native object store that's built for the multi-cloud, creating a consistent data storage layer for your public cloud instances, your private cloud instances, and even your edge instances, depending upon what the heck you're defining those as, which depends probably on where you work. It's getting that unified is one of the greatest challenges facing developers and architects today. It requires S3 compatibility, enterprise-grade security and resiliency, the speed to run any workload, and the footprint to run anywhere, and that's exactly what Minio offers. With superb read speeds in excess of 360 gigs and a 100 megabyte binary that doesn't eat all the data you've got on the system, it's exactly what you've been looking for. Check it out today at min.io/download and see for yourself. That's min.io/download, and be sure to tell them that I sent you. Welcome to the AWS Morning Brief Security Edition, in which I go through the AWS relevant security news of the past week for folks who have to care about security but don't have security in their job title. I'm cloud economist Corey Quinn, and I'm annoying. Let's dive in. I found an article that's titled "SE Linux is Unmanageable. Just turn it off if it gets in your way." I love the title because it's not popular to talk about it because you'll get yelled at by people. But I also don't believe that I've ever met someone who didn't secretly do exactly this, because SE Linux is both a triumph of a security tool that is effective, but it is also simultaneously a complete failure of user experience management. It is user unfriendly, and people who run into its walls first don't realize that that's what's happening. And they also come away with it convinced that the only answer is to spend a week learning how this tool works, but they're trying to do something else at the time. Like the outcome, hate the process. AWS had a couple of interesting things that happened. First, AWS welcomes new transatlantic data privacy framework. You're going to want to pay increased attention to this if your company does business both in North America as well as the EU. Data privacy, the death of safe harbor, etc., etc., etc. If you don't know what I'm talking about and you don't do business on both sides of the pond, great, move on. If you do business on both sides of the pond and don't know what the hell I'm talking about, this might be worth looking into. This episode is sponsored in part by our friends at Vultr. Optimized cloud compute plans have landed at Vultr to deliver lightning-fast processing power courtesy of third-gen AMD EPYC processors without the I/O or hardware limitations of a traditional multi-tenant cloud server. Starting at just $28 a month, users can deploy general-purpose, CPU, memory, or storage-optimized cloud instances in more than 20 locations across 5 continents. Without looking, I know that once again Antarctica has gotten the short end of the stick. Launch your Vultr optimized compute instance in 60 seconds or less on your choice of included operating systems, or bring your own. It's time to ditch convoluted and unpredictable giant tech company billing practices and say goodbye to noisy neighbors and egregious egress forever. Vultr delivers the power of the cloud with none of the bloat. Screaming in the Cloud listeners can try Vultr for free today with $150 in credit when they visit getvultr.com/morning. That's getvultr.com/morning. My thanks to them for sponsoring this ridiculous podcast. How to control access to AWS resources based on AWS account, OU, or organization. This is big because there's never been a better time to dive into making sure that you haven't made an egregious error when you're distinguishing between any AWS user and any AWS user who works at your company. I promise, ask anyone with an open S3 bucket, those are not the same. And lastly, this is a bit of a dive, but AWS has an article that explains what the confused deputy problem is. Specifically, when something that you delegate work to is empowered to do things beyond that. It's hard to defend against this problem, but understanding what it is becomes the necessary first step. And I found a tool. The CloudGoat is a pen test training tool, and it now supports Lambda. It deploys effectively a vulnerable application built in Lambda for you to exploit. You probably don't want to run it in production at a bank. And that's what happened last week in AWS security. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you next week. Thank you for listening to the AWS Morning Brief Security Edition. For the latest in AWS security that actually matters, please follow AWS Morning Brief on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever the hell it is you find the dulcet tones of my voice, and be sure to sign up for the Last Week in AWS newsletter at lastweekinaws.com.
This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.